Hello and welcome friends to this third and final lecture on state and sovereignty. And today in this lecture we will focus on this new ways of looking at governance and the power relationship in the process of governance. And there we will focus on Foucault ideas on governmentality and how it relates to the power of the state and modern government. So, we will basically focus on the governmentality, and through that we will try to understand the functioning of modern state, and this conceptualization of modern state and its power we will see is very different from say liberal state or Marxist state or the feminist state that we have discussed. And it is a kind of new approach to understanding the functioning of a state and its power of governance or processes of governance. So, this is a very radical approach to the idea of modern state and its power, and it also then leads to new theorization of social, political and economic relationships in society. So, many other theorists or social scientists have used or followed these methods of understanding power and the functioning of a state in their theorization of say human relations or man-women relations or the biopower and how new governmentality or new liberal governmentality functions and so on. So, it has opened up new ways of looking at or explaining the functioning of modern state and politics in modern recent times. So far, we have discussed different conceptions of state, where state is by and large defined as a kind of monopoly over legitimate means of violence. So, the broader understanding of state is that it is an institution which controls power, which is an institution where power is concentrated and which then uses that power, which is legitimate power and the authority, and it is seen as that state as an institution yields certain power, exercise certain power because it has the monopoly of the legitimate violence. So, that is the conventional broader understanding of modern state as an institution with a monopoly over legitimate means of violence. So, in this definition we see power as concentrated in the hands of a state, and a state is seen as an institution which holds and exercise power in a society, and such exercise of power is regarded as the legitimate power. Now, in Foucault, while discussing the concept of power, we have seen that his understanding of power is a kind of radical conceptualization which understand power not as something which is suppressive or concentrated, but it is like all pervasive, continuous flow throughout the system. So, the analogy that he makes of power is like bloods in capillaries. So, bloods constantly move. Similarly, in the structure of the society or polity, power is something which constantly moves. So, its power is more dispersed and not concentrated. And the second, power is also productive. So, with this radical conceptualization of power as productive and dispersed rather than concentrated and suppressive, that is the conventional understanding of power is something, some agent, some individual, some institution having certain power to do something. So, there is a kind of agency involved in this understanding of power as a kind of concentration, which enables some individual or institution to affect the behavior of other individual or other institution. Foucauldian understanding of power is a radical conceptualization where power is seen not just concentrated in one institution or individual, but it is dispersed throughout the system, and it is also not just suppressive, but it also has productive dimension of power. So, some of these debates we have discussed while we discuss this power. So, with this radical conceptualization power, 20th century philosopher Michel Foucault provides an unconventional description of governmental power. So, according to him, the exercise of governmental power in contemporary times is the result of this triangular combination of sovereign power, disciplinary power and governmentality. Now, he is saying that while discussing about the techniques of government or the process of governance, we usually make a mistakes by attaching a chronology that say the governance in a particular historical time was more about the sovereignty of the state, then comes the disciplinary power, and finally now we are living in the era of governmentality, which basically we will discuss in details, but which basically means that government controls the subject or the citizens most effectively by not directly or physically interfering with his or her life, but by producing a conditions or creating a condition in which individual or the citizen behaves in a particular way. That is the mode of governmentality, which is the latest or the most recent phenomena in terms of the process of governance. So, we often make this distinction that there was a time when there was a sovereign power, then comes disciplinary power, and now is the era of governmentality. Foucault argues that this kind of chronological sequencing of governance is not the correct ways of looking at, because what we often see in the society is the combination of all these forms of power, sovereign power, disciplinary power and the governmentality together. So, governmentality here is much broader a term than either state or government. So, governmentality is much more about techniques or the modes of governance than the conventional understanding of a state as the sovereign power or the government which exercises the power of the state. Governmentality refers to the conduct of conduct. So, it a kind of musical phraseology and not very explicitly explain the functioning of the government in the modern societies, and we will discuss how complex such modes of governmentality is. But basically it talks about where government exercises its power by creating a conditions, by producing a conditions in which the subject or the individual may feel free, that he or she has the decision or the freedom to make decisions governing his or her life. But the structure of governance is such that the choices that individual is going to make is already always preconditioned by the modes of governmentality and so on. So, governmentality, which is much broader a term than state and government, is something that refers to the conduct of conduct. So, it creates its conditions or produce the conditions which determines the choices that individual have or decisions that individual may have in a given society. So, it radically altered the way in which we understand power and government. So, this idea of governmentality, which is new and which leads to new kind of theorization about power relationship in society, is something which radically altered our understanding of power and government. And it also influenced a great many thinkers such as Giorgio Agamben. If some of you are interested, you may think about the biopolitics and biopower. We will briefly discuss it in one of our slides today. And Judith Butler, Deleuze, Paul Robinson and many others are influenced by this kind of radical conceptualization of power, state and government. Now, coming back to this idea of governmentality, its meanings and features, we can see governmentality as a combination of these two terms, government and rationality, and how the both are interlinked is something which we will discuss in next one or two slides. But governmentality as a term can be seen as a kind of combination of these techniques or the modes of governance as in government and the tools and techniques of knowledge or surveillance and so on as in the rationality. So, the governmentality in that sense is a combination of these two terms, government and rationality. governmentality emphasized that governing is an art, and to govern effectively it requires knowledge. So, this relationship between knowledge and power we have discussed, and how the both is interlinked, how it is not just that the knowledge which empowers or which gives power to the agent, but it is the power structure which determines what kind of knowledge is regarded as authoritative knowledge. So, it is a kind of interlinking. So, governmentality emphasized that governing is an art, and to govern effectively it requires knowledge, techniques and various modes and mechanisms of governing. And these modes and mechanisms and techniques of governing is not just about the rule or the constitution or the authority, but it transcends those conventional, limited or narrow definition of a state and its power. So, he argued that governmentality refers to the conduct or an activity. So, the governmentality refers to the conduct or an activity that mean to shape, guide or affect the conduct of the people. So, the objective of the governmentality is to shape, guide and affect the conduct of the people without directly or physically interfering in their decision making. So, the effectiveness of governmentality is the invisibleness of the direct physical interference in the lives of the citizens. So, citizen may in their individual, personal, private domain feel that they are free to make decisions, but the functions of governmentality create the structure which already always conditions and limits the choices that the individual may have. So, the effectiveness of governmentality is its aim to conduct or act in a manner which shape, guide and affect the conduct of the people. So, conduct does not mean government directing or guiding one's life personally or physically, but it is about direct oneself or self-governance which is already conditioned by the government or the functioning of governmentality. So, in the process of governing, governmentality classifies people into various groups to manage or rule them better. So, the techniques or the rationality of the government is to first gather or they collect knowledge about the population or the ruled, and once that knowledge is gathered, then classify them into different groups and then accordingly formulate policy so that they can better managed or ruled by the government. So, it classifies the people into various groups using the tools of statistics and methods of surveillance, and that enables the modern government to manage its population, right, and rule them better. So, in the modern practices of governance, the statistical tools or the rationality or the knowledge or the techniques are as significant as its coercive apparatus, and modern governmentality tries to functions more effectively without relying on the coercive or the brute force of the state. So, in the sovereign power, in the monarchy, in disciplinary power, you have those coercive apparatus using very often by the state. But in the phase of governmentality, what you see is the condition where citizens or subjects are classified into different groups, and accordingly different policies are formulated to manage them better, to rule them better and give them the space where they may assume that they are free to make decisions, but that decision is already always conditioned by the functioning of governance or governmentality. So, modern government according to Foucault is about how to govern oneself, how to be governed, how to govern others, by whom the people will accept to be governed, and how to become the best possible governor. So, that is the whole functions of a modern government, that is not just about some body which is governing the other, but it is also about governing oneself. How to govern, whom to accept as the governor, and how to effectively govern. So, these are some of the concerns of modern government, and in this broad sense, government is then not just limited to say the idea of rule or legitimacy or state institutions alone. So, the objective of state and the government is then in this broader conception where government is much beyond one agent or the institution ruling the rest of the population, but it also includes the elements of how to govern oneself, by whom one should be willing to be governed, and on what basis one should govern others, and so on. This broader understanding of government is then not just limited to the idea of rule, legitimacy or state institution, but it also equally applicable to the self, family, workplace or asylum and so on. So, it transcended the conventional boundary of state and government that talks about basically the rules, the institutions, the idea of legitimacy and so on. The functioning of governmentality transcend these conventional realm of government to include self, family, workplace, asylum, prison and so on and so forth. So, in other words, for Foucault, governing involves directing the behavior of the body individual, and that relates to the idea of subjectivity. How the tools and techniques of government produce newer subjectivities, where individuals are already made subject or docile enough to obey the process of governance or to obey the state without questioning, without much resistance. So, governing involves directing the behavior of the body individual, the body social and the body politic by means other than force or even explicit rules. So, the tools and the techniques of governance by and large is something which is not direct force or direct use of force or the coercive apparatus of the state such as police, army and so on, and also the explicit rule. So, in other words, the functioning of governmentality is seen most effective when there is no visible use of force or imposition of rule, and yet the population conduct or behave in a manner which strengthen the legitimacy or the authority of the state and its institution. So, that is the functions of modern governmentality, which tries to or aims to produce newer subjectivity, newer individual, or what we can also call docile body, which is willing to obey the authority or the command of the state and institution. So, the governing actually involves directing the behavior of the body individual, the body social and the body politic by means other than force or even explicit rule. So, whether conducted on oneself, by oneself or on a social body by a combination of political, economic and social powers, government operates through and molds the capacity of governed body to regulate its own behavior. So, the idea is that the governing of oneself by the oneself or on a social body by a combination of these political, economic and social powers, government operates through and molds the capacity of governed body, whether it is the individual or the society or the body politic and so on, to regulate its own behavior. So, that scope or freedom to govern, to regulate oneself is provided, and in this regard paradoxically presupposes a degree of freedom on the part of the governed. So, those who are ruled over or those who are governed may presuppose a degree of freedom in this structure of governmentality, where they are provided with the space to regulate their life, to govern themselves. But the way they regulate and govern themselves is already conditioned by the power of governmentality, the techniques of governmentality. So, governmentality as a term Foucault deploy to understand how rationality functions and operates within the structure of governance, and also how governance itself is seen as involving rationality. So, the combination of these two words, government and rationality, is therefore very significant in understanding governmentality. So, it is the integral part of governance, and in fact governance itself is seen as involving rationality. So, it aims to understand the governance by the combination of institutions, knowledge and disciplinary practices. So, these are the three mechanisms through which governmentality or the process of governance operates or functions in modern societies. So, according to Foucault, governmentality has four key features, and these key features of governmentality is: one, that individual, mass, national or transnational bodies and their energies, needs, capacities and desires. So, to understand any or each one of these, what are the capacities or the desires or the needs of the individual, the group of individual in sense of mass, the national people or the international transnational bodies. To understand their desires, to understand their needs and the capacities requires enormous capacity or the tools and techniques to collect information, use that information for ordering, managing and directing this whole set of peoples, starting from the individual to mass to the national to the transnational. So, the first feature of governmentality is it tries to acquire the knowledge or gather the knowledge or information about individual, mass, national or transnational bodies and their energies, needs and capacities and desires, and then order it, manage it and direct it in a particular way. So, the effectiveness of the governmentality lies in the knowledge of the population, use of the statistics and so on to understand their energies, needs, capacities and desires, and then accordingly formulate policies to order them, to manage them and to direct them in a particular manner. Second, governmentality has a vast range of points of operation. So, there is no just one sides of government or the practices of governmentality. Governmentality has a vast range of points of operation and application, from individual to mass populations and from particular parts of the body and psyche to appetites and ethics, works or citizenship practices. So, for example, the discourse on say health, the medicine, safety in modern liberal government is seen as or perhaps more important than say discourse on rights of the individual against the new liberal state. So, this citizen is also seen as a kind of subject of governmentality or governmental power. So, the second feature of governmentality is that it has a vast range or points of operation, which includes both, which is seen as political and not so political, and the significance of such discourses or the sides of power is equally drawn in terms of understanding or explaining the functioning of governmentality. So, from individual to the mass population, from particular parts of the body to the psyche or the appetites and ethics are all included in understanding the functioning of governance in modern society. Third, governmental is something which is far from being restricted to rule, law or other kinds of visible and accountable power. It works through a range of invisible and non-accountable social powers. So, for example, pastoral power. Now, the example of this pastoral power is something to understand how governmentality functions and operates not within the limits or purview of say rule, laws and accountable power or authority, but it operates in multiple ways through a range of invisible or non-accountable social powers. So, for example, the power of the pastoral, and Foucault uses it in explaining that how power emanates in one sphere and then migrate to the another sphere, and it is as effective and perhaps more effective in other spheres than the sphere in which it emerged or emanated in the first place. So, for example, the pastoral power which migrates from church. So, church, the pastoral is the authority or the authoritative figure, but it is not limited to the church. The pastoral power emerged or emanated in church, but it also infiltrate or interfere in the sphere of say state, workplace and so on. So, it is not just restricted to the rule, law or other kinds of visible accountable power, but it works through a range of invisible or non-accountable social powers like the pastoral power. So, pastoral power is one such example, but there are multiple examples through which modern governmentality operates, not just through the mechanism of rules, laws and the accountable institution, but also using the existing structural societal power which migrates, which is often invisible and has influence in other spheres of the life of population also. Now, the fourth, and that is drawing from the third, is that governmentality both employs and infiltrate a number of discourses which is ordinarily conceived as unrelated to the political power, governance or the state. So, governmentality transcend this limited understanding of governmental discourse that is merely limited to political power, governance and state. So, when we talk about government or the state, we often refer to those discourses that is particularly related to modern state or governance or the politics. Governmentality often employs or infiltrate those discourses which is in the ordinary sense not seen as something which is related to politics or state or the governance. So, for example, the scientific discourse, you know, on the idea of medicine, allopathy or Ayurveda, homeopathy and so on, the scientific knowledge in comparison to say traditional or conventional knowledge, that scientificity of a knowledge sanctions certain authority to a particular forms of knowledge, and this we have discussed in the lecture on power. So, this scientific discourse or the religious discourse which is about ethics, morality and other worldly affairs, or the popular discourses in any society, these are the discourses which may in the ordinary sense seen as not related directly to the power of the state or the governance, but governmentality includes these discourses also to understand the functioning of power and the operation of power in a society. So, thus governmentality transcends the conventional boundaries of state or government, it transcends the conventional boundaries of state and government and draws upon, and this point is very crucial to understand the all inclusive or most comprehensive understanding of governmentality or the governance, and yet there is a scope for newer identities or the use of power in the productive manner. So, it transcends this conventional boundaries of state or government and draws upon, without unifying, centralizing or rendering systematic or even consistent, a range of powers and knowledge dispersed across the modern society. So, this is very crucial that it transcends this conventional boundaries of state and government to includes a range of power and knowledges that is dispersed across the society, be it medical discourse, political discourse, popular discourse and so on and so forth, but it does not unify them or centralize them. So, there is a kind of disperse or a kind of looseness in terms of the power structure, and yet together it constitute the condition where individual is subjected to the most effective power of governmentality, and yet paradoxically they may feel that they are free to make decisions governing his or her own life. So, in modern market economy, many of you may feel that market gives you enough choice, but also market conditions your choice to have. So, that is just the brute example of how governmentality functions, but it is about creating the conditions or create in other words the phrase that Foucault used, conducting the conducts. So, that is about the governmentality. So, the governmentalization thus refers to internal reorganization of a state which connects. So, it is about internal reorganization of a state which connects the constitutional, fiscal, organizational and judicial power of the state. So, this is the conventional idea of state and government, that is about constitutional, fiscal, organizational and judicial power, with endeavors to manage the economic life, the health, the habits of population, the civility of the masses and so on. So, the governmentalization is about reorganization of the state which connects the limited or the narrow understanding of state in the sense of constitutional, fiscal, organizational and judicial power to endeavors to manage the economic life or the health or the habits of the population and how they should be disciplined in a particular way. So, this governmentalization or the process of governmentality ensures that state and governance is not just about constitution, rules, authority and so on, but it also endeavor to manage the economic life, the health habits and discipline of population. So, according to Foucault, state then is more like a composite reality and mythicized abstraction which fails to explain the modes through which a modern citizen subject, citizen in a sense of docile body, right, is produced, positioned, classified, organized and above all mobilized by an array of governing sites and capacities. So, through governmentality you can better understand how the tools and techniques and the modes of governance produced, position, classify, organize or mobilize the modern citizen and subjects, which the conventional or abstract idea of state fails to argue, and through governmentality you can better understand how power operates. Now, very briefly on this idea of biopower and biopolitics that emerged out of this conception of governmentality, and it further developed by Thomas Lemke and many others. This biopolitics and biopower emerged with the governmentality, and it is regarded as a mode of power which is exercised to manage or control the nature of demography in a state. It deals with the biological issue, basically about birth, death, health, that describes the nature of demography of the state. So, the idea of how to create a docile body which will be willing to obey without any resistance, without the question. So, the state also tries to control, regulate the birth, deaths and health of their citizen. In doing so, it exercises a power which creates a new population or new subjectivity, which is something that is a kind of docile body willing to obey the state or the institution of the state without much resistance. So, it shows the emergence of state as a modern form of power and the role of the government as the agent of the state to address the issue of population, its needs, its increasing figures and factors, to control and manage the growth of population and its activities. So, the political intervention of governmentality paves the way for biopolitics. It is referred to the specific interventions of the government into the species life or human beings in order to control births, deaths, reproduction, sexuality and to manage the growth of population in the state. So, this governmentally focuses on this another aspect of power that intervenes into the personal or private life of the people. So, this is something very modern, very recent, where the personal or what is regarded as the intimate sphere of individual life, and there also the power of a state is pervasive. It is effective in terms of making decisions about childbirth, death, health, and so on and so forth. Now, the significance of governmentality, one lies with this idea that it helps us understand the functions of modern government or the process of governance much beyond the conventional idea of state and government, to include those domains, those discourses which is often seen in the ordinary sense as non-political or apolitical, and yet how power operates and functions there. The second most crucial part of governmentality is that it is making the governance most effective, not by its coercive forces or physical forces, but by producing a condition, creating a circumstances which in which individual may have the option or may feel that they are free to make decisions, but their decisions or choices are already always conditioned by the functioning of governmentality. So, Foucault emphasized that governmentality focuses not on governing with power over death, but power over life, and that is very crucial thing also, that is not about suppressing or power over death, but what individual do in his life. So, for him power over life involved in two basic forms. These forms were not antithetical to each other, that is a kind of complementary to each other. However, they constituted rather two poles of development linked together by a whole intermediary cluster of relations. One of these centered on the body as a machine, its disciplinary to optimization of its capabilities, the extortion of its forces, the parallel increase of its usefulness and docility, its integration into the system of efficient and economic controls. All this was ensured by procedures of power that characterize the disciplines, the anatomo-politics of human body. So, the effect, the significance of governmentality lies in controlling or disciplining or the optimization of the individual capabilities, and then using it for the integration or inclusion in the system of governmental controls, and which is economic and most regular. So, the approach for doing that is to target the body, the individual body and his or her personal capacities, and then allowing that body or the individual to have freedom, and yet using that freedom for the advantage of the governmental control or to ensuring the effectiveness of government functions. So, governmentality as a concept allow you to understand some of these nuance or the minute ways through which government or governing power operates in disciplining the body, even when it seems to give them the freedom to exercise his or her choice. So, now in summing up, I have seen that this is very briefly about some arguments about the very existence of a state, very legitimacy of a state is questioned. So, you have many scholars, unlike liberals who consider the state as evil, but liberals consider a state as necessary evil. So, it is necessary for protection of individual life and property. So, therefore, it obstructs human freedom, yet such obstruction can be tolerable if the state provides protection to individual life and liberty. So, in liberal philosophy you have state as a necessary evil. So, it is evil, nonetheless it is necessary evil. However, many anarchists who questions the existence of a state argue that a state is not only evil, but it is also unnecessary institution. So, they argue for creating a stateless society where there will be no state, and that society will be a self-governing society of enlightened citizens. So, the anarchist tradition in political theory and philosophy questions the very existence of a state which is seen as limiting or curbing the human freedom and creativity, and its existence is always coercive, always problematic for the individual and his creativity and freedom. So, therefore, they are arguing for creating a society which will be a stateless society of self-governing enlightened citizen. So, that is a argument very briefly about anarchist criticism to the legitimacy or the existence of modern state. With the globalization, new challenges are posed before the state. So, it is argued that globalization is a serious challenge to state and sovereignty, and globalization can be seen as a process which has multi-dimensional aspects to it, which may be economic with the growth of say multinational companies or transnational companies and so on. It may be the cultural and basically led by this information and communication technology revolutions, where it is easy to connect with the people across the world, to get the news across the world in a matter of second, right. So, this multi-dimensional process which we call globalization has many aspects or spheres that includes economic, cultural and political dimensions of life, and we can discuss it in much details, but we can understand the force of globalization, that anything that is happening in other parts of the world immediately affects the a very distant part of the world. So, world is becoming increasingly interconnected. So, in this ever increasing integration of societies, people and economies, and making of the global village which we call, right, we all are now living in a global village. So, the distance and time and space in a sense is very much reduced by this information and communication technology. So, with this ever increasing integration of the society and making of global village, the status of modern nation state and its sovereignty, as we have discussed, is also altered. So, institutions like United Nations, World Trade Organization or supranational entity like ASEAN, European Union, transnational companies or multinational companies severely affect the sovereignty of the state. So, state is willing to compromise, to willing to trade off with transnational bodies such as political institutions like European Union, where the nation state is willing to come together to have one constitution, one overarching political authority, one currency and so on. So, this severely affect the sovereignty of the state. However, a state is reaffirming its authority and becoming even more relevant and powerful institution. And we must not assume that authority of the state, precisely because of this globalization or making of global village, is waning. In fact, they are becoming even more stronger. So, modern state and government remains the most legitimate form of authority, and its sovereignty continues to play a significant roles within the territory of the state as well as externally among the international community of nation states. So, why nation state is still relevant? Because within its territory, state is seen as the supreme authority, and outside its territory in the external community of nation state, it is seen as the most authoritative and the legitimate voice of that people. So, there are talks and arguments about thinking beyond the nation state frames, but it still, that means the nation state frame still remains a very powerful frame to organize political life and understand the functioning of power in a given society, and therefore, the state and sovereignty remains a very strong, relevant and significant frame to understand the political organizations or the functioning of power in modern society. So, that is all on this lecture today. You can refer to some of these texts to understand the things that we have discussed in this lecture today, and to know more about this idea of governmentality and biopower and biopolitics, you should refer to Thomas Lemke or Michel Foucault governmentality will give you the more in-depth understanding of the governmentality. So, that is all in today's lecture. Do let us know what you think, or please write to us if you have any queries and doubts. We will be very happy to respond within 24 hours. So, thanks for listening. Thank you all.